We'll go ahead and open it up with sort of free-for-all. Did you have any questions about the hurriedly presented chapter last week?
About the letter chapter?
Hurriedly presented chapter.
Oh. Okay. What a lot of material, actually.
I have a question on Homer.
Okay, and 1 second. What was your...
I was confused on, it talked about when you make the aorist, the vowel at the beginning of the stem is lengthened. For example, alpha and epsilon turn into eta.
Mm-hmm.
Does an omicron turn into omega?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Yeah, so
What are the rules for lengthening?
alpha and epsilon will become an eta. I don't know of any verbs that start with iota. I don't think there are such animals. There might be. But I think that if there are, I'm sure there are, I think most of them start with a rough breathing mark. Like hieron, that's not a verb, that's a noun.
No, that's contraction.
That's the verb of iskuros.
Iskurapo, I think. It's not here though. I'm gonna. No. Yeah, I'm not sure. I've never seen the lengthening of the iota. I think that it's a tricky one. Because you've got, for instance, histame, but that rough breathing mark comes from an original sigma that's there that has been reduced to a rough breathing mark. So we'll leave the iotas out of the discussion because I'm not sure, and I don't think that it happens. I think other things happen with that. And then you just have alpha, epsilon, iota, omicron, and omega. So yeah, omicron that goes to omega.
And the upsilon?
Upsilon. It's another tricky one. I can't think of an instance where it happens. This the moment I'm thinking of only instances where the upsilon has a rough breathing mark on it as well. Man, you're tripping me up already. It's a good sign for the class. So far as the verbs that we've got Parco. Yeah, I've honestly never been asked that. I just typically deal with those three vowels that lengthen.
What
The
about,
only verb that has one in this book, and I'll get
yeah, I was going to say in this book.
is huparco, and the contraction would take place within the verb because you have huparco, and then this is a compounded, so you have huber. Yeah. Another question on the chapter. You kind of grasp the principles of contraction and the idea behind liquid verbs. With liquid verbs, you have the letter that can't take the sigma, your liquid consonants, the lambda, mu, nu, and rho. So what happens is we have lengthening within it, and for the most part, they're not too difficult to recognize. The real trick with those verbs is that changes happen within the stem, and we've been learning what the changes happen in the stem if it is a aorist. So you have to be a little weary of that. Now we have to modify that principle in our brain to say, if a change happens in the stem, let's take a look to see if there's a liquid consonant, if there's a lambda, a mu, a nu, and a rho. And if there is, are there any other elements that can tip me off that this is an aorist versus a future? So with the future verbs, for the most part, they look more like your lexical form, whereas some other change takes place with the aorist. we have aorist endings versus future endings, for instance.
I noticed the differences are very subtle to the present
Yes.
future, like I abide, it's just that diacritic, and what's the mark over the negative
Yeah, it's a circumflex
circumflex?
versus the acute accent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, also it talked about some liquid consonants are doubled in their present active indicative forms. Are there rules involving that, or is it?
No, what he's saying there is that, for instance, I think what he's saying there is
Like envelope?
Angelo takes an extra lambda in its present form, so it's alpha, gamma, gamma, epsilon, lambda, lambda, as opposed to 1. He's saying it reverts back to its root form in the future. And that the terminology gets a little crisscrossed because we think of the lexical form as most often being the root form, but in these instances that's not the case. Your root form shows up in the future as opposed to being in the present. And all of those details, they're important if you want to know them, but really catching the nuances and the changes in the verb is really the key. So these are questions dealing with liquids. Did we pretty much get contracts then? Knowing, I guess, for me, when I learned contracts, contract verbs were very easy to grasp the principles and to see examples laying out and have an explanation for them. That was the easy part. The difficult part for me for contracts was when I see one of those verbs out in the wild, knowing that it's a contract and knowing how to work back to what the original form was. That's the only difficulty with contract verbs. I guess we'll do the exercises then and see how well we were able to work back and what kind of questions we had. And I do apologize for those of you that do look at the video. I haven't gotten it up yet. iMovie is what you have been using. Apple decided to give iLife away for free for the upgrades, which is great because now I have the newest version for nothing. The problem with that is they've standardized the way that you convert or export, and it's done some weird things with me. I think that what's happening is every time my screensaver comes on, it shuts iMovie off. It crashes the program. So I typically convert or export the video at night because it takes like 10 hours to do that. And it's crashed a couple of times on me now. So I've turned off those settings and hopefully it'll work. It's been frustrating. So it's in the process of converting last week's lecture now. We'll see if it works. All right, number 1. And for the sake of time, we won't do pronunciation, we'll just do translation.
You shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save the people from their sin.
Is there a difference? Does it matter if you say will versus shall?
No, not particularly. I think that shall is becoming more of an outdated way of expressing the future, but so far as our vernacular today, they both express the same thing.
Sounds more biblical.
It sounds more King James Version. Yes?
That, why is that second L2 in that second half of the verse?
Okay, so you shall call his name Jesus. Which L2 are you looking at? For he, autos, that's the nominative. It's the subject. He will save the people of him, or his people, from their sins.
Okay. Got it.
All right, and just for the heck of it, we have call Kaleses. From.
Colin.
Good. Kaleto. Alright, so what are our distinguishing features here?
The sigma?
Yep. Okay, so we have a sigma here. Now that sigma, it does. Starting off, before jumping right there, we have a sigma, and there are only two types of verbs that do have sigmas. They are aorist and future. So from there, we can ask, does it have an augment? Does it have a stem change? Does it have an alpha? Does it have any of those things? It doesn't have them. We already know that. We have the correct parsing. Kaleto is a future, it's active, indicative. Now, where's the ace come from?
First, or primary active endings.
Yep. So OSA, Armanatusen. This isn't the best verb to illustrate it on because of the fact that when we have epsilon contracting with an A, the epsilon drops out, then we still get our same ending ace. So we're good on that. Good. All right, number 2.
But why do you all call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?
Good.
That's the rough one.
Yeah, why do you call me Lord, Lord, not do what I say? Or why do you not do that which I say? Any of those would work.
That was an interesting construction of Curio.
Okay, yeah, good. So, curry,
Hey,
A comes from,
Curio.
now curio, os,
Us.
and then this was the only paradigm that we had a particular form for. So we had os, u, o, on, e. So this was obviously the nominative, the genitive, dative, accusative, and I heard it, the vocative. And that is the address, or it's calling out. Call me Lord, Lord. Right? Okay? 3.
And you will love your Lord God from all your heart and from all your soul.
Head with.
And you will love what now?
You will love your Lord God from all your heart and from all your soul.
Okay, close. I'd say you will love the Lord your God.
Now, where do you get the Lord?
Soup.
But it can be of you or you.
Yes. The Lord, the God of you.
Can you talk about the set? The with. I had with.
Out of works, from all your heart, from all your soul, with works as well. It's just a nuance that we'll say is capable of being expressed with ek. Without going any further than that. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, it was like a translator prerogative to help construct the thought.
It's the novice student's perception of a translator's prerogative. We'll get into different uses of the genitive later. And I want you to start to see, and that's what he wants you to do. He wants to start to see, wants you to start to see the variety with which you can translate. And the explanation for that variety will come later.
For
This God loved the world.
Yeah, close.
Thus, or in this manner, God loved the world.
Yeah, hutos is tos, not tos. If it were tos, then it would be this. But we have a tos ending, and that is an adverbial ending. So what this verse is saying is in this way or in this manner. And it's not God loved the world so much, it's this is the way he loved it, and then we go to find out how he loved it, and the rest of that verse, which is he sent his only son to die.
So this is the that in the translation. For God so loved the world, that.
It's the so. God so loved
Oh, it's
the world.
Okay.
That is, it's either hati in the rest of that verse, or it's implied as being the content of how he loved it. All right. Number 5.
We love because he first loved us.
Good.
Hati was usually that, but I put it because.
That's good thing you did that. Can be that or because in this instance we're being given a reason for why. So let's take a look at these verbs. Ga, ho, min, and a, ga, pays, I believe.
Yeah.
Alright, and they're both from
God.
aga, pa. Stressing that because knowing what it's from
That sounds right.
is important. Agapao. Alright, so here, what do we find?
There's an omega. That's the.
Good, we have an omega. And it is important that we notice these things because you remember when I told you about the subjunctive as sort of a looking forward that we lengthen the connecting vowel? Knowing later on what's happening here is important so that we can distinguish it from those sorts of verbs. So we have an alpha from agapao contracting with what letter here?
An omicron.
An omicron, good, from amen. Always say amen, it's an usin. So that contraction when we have an alpha with an O class goes to our omega. That's why we have that pair. So now we've explained this connecting vowel as being contracted. Are there any other features in this verb that help to tell us what it is? Sorry, I wasn't supposed to be there. So we don't have an eta here to tell us that it's an imperfect or an aorist. We don't have a sigma, we don't have a sigma alpha, we don't have reduplication, we don't have a theta eta, we have none of that. It's just pure form. And this helps us to also tell us that an active ending. So we have a present, active, indicative. Here, though, we have an augment
Stuff.
and a sigma. So an augment plus a sigma. If we just had the augment, it might be an imperfect or it might be an aorist. But an augment plus a sigma gives us our aorist. So there's our aorist, and we have an active ending. We still only have indicatives, and then this is in, honest in, our third singular. All right, 5. No, we just did 5. That was 5.
Twice, didn't
We did, and I think that was partly to illustrate. How about number 6?
I write to you, young men, because you have overcome the evil, but they say the evil one.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not quite sure where they get the evil one versus just plain overcome evil.
Sure. Paneron is what kind of what kind of word? Is it a noun, an adjective, a verb, or an adverb?
Adjective. Substantive.
Yeah, you got that right there. It is a substantive adjective. So what my question was to ask you what type of word it was. When we find out that it's an adjective, we see that it is not being paired, no noun. When there is no noun being paired with it, then it can often be substantive. Now, here's a little trick. It's a little tricky here with adverbs. Adjectives like this. Now, it could be the evil one, or it could be evil in general, right? Because, and that's particularly difficult in the Lord's Prayer. Deliver us from, some translations may read the evil one, or deliver us from evil in general. And that is a translation decision based upon the context. What is the author talking about? So I think that John is particularly talking about the evil one here.
Is personifying evil a distinctive of John?
I'm not going to answer that because I'm not there, so to speak. It's not coming to me immediately. 7.
Blessed are the pure in heart, because they will see God.
Good. Any questions on that one? Where did you get blessed are the pure? What kind of construction do we have there? Predicate. Perfect. So you have the adjective there is with the article there is with the adjective. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Looks like pure is
This
the article.
article is now.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. The article is with the noun. Correct.
So where do you get R?
That's what we get from the predicate construction. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Remember, you could do asin in order to have that same construction, or you can just leave the verb out entirely. So, blessed are the pure in heart, because they will see God.
What defines a predicate again?
It predicates something about the noun. The adverb predicates. It states some sort of quality about it. The ball is red, as opposed to the red ball.
Okay. I'll do the next one. I've got some wrinkle. The righteousness of God is being revealed. I see some faith combination there. I couldn't figure out what it was. From faith, in faith. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith.
Okay, anybody helping?
It's ek pisteos, eis pistine. That's what they're.
The righteousness of God is being revealed in Him. In alto, I think you missed that.
Okay, I did.
From faith into faith, just as it has been written. Or you could just simply translate that just as it is written. And the righteous will live by faith. Now that one's a fun one, Because you notice how ek is being used in two different ways there, right? So we have in the first instance, it is being revealed from faith into faith. And then the next usage of ek is
So it's in
the righteous will live by faith. So that's, again, starting to illustrate a variety of ways that you can translate it based upon the context.
Yeah.
And don't try to get me to exegete that passage for you, please. Because what it means for the righteousness of God to be revealed from faith into faith, I would need a little bit of help on.
That's one that we meditate on.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. It's like faith here. The genitive from faith,
Mm-hmm.
ekpisteos, into faith. So that is the accusative.
Yep. And then ace has to have the accusative with it.
Okay. Ek is dos, pistos,
Pisteos.
pisteos. And what construct is that? Is that
Still a genitive.
Still genitive, but it's a different genitive.
Mhm.
From ek pisteos.
It's different, translated different, but the form is the exact same.
It's different to me. Did I have it copied wrong? Pretty sure it is. I wrote it down.
It's the same. It's the difference between
Scribal
form
error.
and function. Exactly. Number 9.
In that day y'all will ask in my name, and I do not say to you that I will ask the Father about you.
From that day, in the name of me, you will ask, and I say not to you because I will request the Father concerning you. That was an awful mess.
Yeah, that was pretty close. I mean,
I mean,
I translated in that day, you will ask in my name,
Right.
and I am not saying to you, or I do not say to you, that I will ask the Father concerning you or for you. Let me pull out my Bible so we can give you a little more of a context for that. It makes sense because it does seem like an odd construction. I know that it did when I was translating it as well. So that is John 16:26. So right before that in 25, I have said these things to you in figures of speech. The hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figures of speech, but will tell you plainly about the Father. In that day you will ask in my name, and I do not say to you that I will ask the Father on your behalf. The Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and have come into the world, and now I am leaving the world and going to the Father.
That was tough to, I can just picture that in Greek.
Get there. We're working. Number 10. So you can tell from the English translation that he translated it just in the same way that the ESV did. Context helps us a lot.
Number 10, then the high priest asked Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching.
Perfect.
I had a very hard time finding that word, ask.
Mm-hmm. And it is...
It's in an aorist active form,
Mm-hmm.
but backtracking, this little bugger took me over 20 minutes to figure out.
But you finally figured it out, which is good. So let's see if we can walk through it. Yeah. know how much I'm going to be able to help you on that.
Well,
Some of it we can see. It's from, do you remember?
It's from, or tail.
From Iteo. Iteo. Yeah, I think that's just one that you need to memorize. Did he not have that one listed?
is it Iteo or Aristotle?
Or Iro, you mean?
Page 138.
Word in A? Epsilon rho omega.
Yes.
Omega? Okay.
Yes. I was like, this is not making any sense. But if you'll notice, Iteo means virtually the same thing. That helps me a lot. Sitting here like, he didn't give you that as a form to memorize or to be familiar with. And I have no clue how to come up with that. So now we can see it a little bit easier, right? So when the aorist, what do we do?
All makes sense now, doesn't it?
Yes.
You had the right word instead of
That's helpful, isn't it?
all the time.
Alright, so when we want to change this to an aorist, we isolate the front and then we lengthen it because we can't add an augment on top of it. We don't have a consonant to front with. So this becomes our A. We still keep our rho. And then the alpha of it is going to lengthen inside. And our sigma from the aorist is fine. And we get the ending. $11.
I give thanks to God always for all of you.
Good. Good correction there. We give thanks to God always concerning who? Concerning what now?
All of you.
Good. All of
So what is tantone?
Always.
Isn't that all?
How do I get all of you?
Oh, okay, so we give thanks to God always concerning all of you. So the second all comes from pantone,
And always was Pantate.
pantate, yes. The one is a marker of time, and the other one is,
Give thanks to God always.
do we not have, I don't think that we've had that word.
I couldn't find it in the dictionary. And I kept skimming through the chapters and I wasn't finding it. I mean, I could find pantota, but I couldn't find the pantone.
So you found pantata
Yes,
in the dictionary?
in the back, yes.
Oh, there it is.
Paragraph 97.
Paragraph 97.
But I didn't see anywhere it said that you could add endings to it. So I didn't know what, it was a blank for me there.
Okay. Pantone is from pas. And it is the third declension. That's where you're getting it to why it looks like pantata with the tau being added. So we have pas, And then if you look on page, where are we? Page 124. You've got pos, pontos, ponti, ponton, ponta rather, pontes, ponton. Mhm. 12.
Well, I'm sorry, I was back at Pantate,
Mhm.
Terry.
Mhm.
And that's
We think,
give thanks to God always for all of you.
Yep.
So
For
Terry is
concerning.
for.
it can be that.
Okay.
What is our helpful little dictionary say that translated as? Peri can be about, concerning, for, or with the genitive around. So yeah,
But for always, okay, for all of you.
for all of you.
Okay. So I had that constructed Pantate.
12.
Okay,
Yeah.
for the Father loves you all, because you have loved me and you have believed that I from God blank. And I couldn't back up that word.
Alright, let's back up that word. Well, let's not write it up there or back it up because that's the word we keep on coming back to every week, isn't it? So, thon, taking off the X,
As a compound?
it is a compound, so X is ek.
Okay.
But now let's look at
Couldn't
this.
see
Do we
that.
remember this? Aelthon? Susan does. Susan's got a steel trap from memory. For the rest of us who took a lot longer to learn this word, it's from erkamai. Erkamai. So it's ek erkamai, or ex erkamai rather. So when you have the kappa
Fall
next to a vowel, it becomes X. It means to go out. The only thing I'd modify in the translation you gave already is adding the nuance of the autos for the Father himself. Loves us because we,
That was you.
yes, you all.
So is the himself from the altos? Or is Pele middle? Or how does that work?
It's the intensive use of autos. Do you remember that long, long ago in a land far, far away? Let me see if I can find the chapter it was in. It was in our
It's because we didn't need the he, we already had the Father.
right.
They added the extra.
Yes,
And because you added the extra, that stresses
yes.
so you add the himself, I self, myself, whatever.
Simply put, absolutely. If you wanted a more technical definition, we have page 68 and 69 for your special uses of autos. Either the same or himself, or the two different uses we could have.
So the end of that is because, what was Erkamine meaning?
Because I went out from God. So give it to me all together.
The Father himself loves you.
Because
Because you believe that I came.
you missed one verb, because you
have loved me,
Mm-hmm.
and you have believed that, roughly, I, from God, I came out from God.
So that's what I wanted to ask you. Kate. You have loved me?
Yeah, you have loved. We have the reduplication of the fee. Remember what happens? They de-aspirate an aspirated consonant, and all an aspirated consonant means is it makes two different sounds. So theta, th, tuh, fee, puh. What'll happen is the first of that gets reduplicated. So the P sound gets reduplicated. And I made the illustration that sometimes we do that in English as well, which is illustrated by when we pronounce this, we say amphitheater instead of amphitheater. We do the same thing. Sometimes we don't do it systematically like they do, but it's the same concept.
Epistukate, that's reduplication.
Mm-hmm.
Pistua,
Good.
kate, so you have believed, so it's errors.
Not an error. You've got the translation and the marker's perfect.
Okay, but it is perfect.
Yeah, I kind of gave it to you in the way I phrased that.
That's
You got them perfect.
true.
And the K was the clue.
The reduplication and the kappa.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the kappa and the reduplication.
So running through our little clues again, just as a quick overview. We have the augment alone, which tells us what?
Imperfect or errors.
Imperfect. Without anything else, just the augment. We have imperfect. The sigma alone, no other features, just the sigma. Future. The augment and the sigma alpha. Aorist. Reduplication and the kappa alpha. Perfect. Theta eta.
Passive.
Good.
Theta,
Theta eta. They are passive. Theta eta. Passive. And typically the theta eta can only go with the future passive and the aorist passive. So that really narrows things down for us. It's not just passive, it's got to be one of the two of those.
I know you covered the last word there. If
That doesn't have any of those signs. That's just one of your second aorist forms that we learn to recognize over time.
it's one of the irritating words.
Yes, that is the technical Jacob term. It is one of the irritating words.
Yeah. And it is I came.
Or when we add the ek onto it, go out.
I came out.
And that same sort of concept there is being not sort of being reduplicated, but not in the sort of same sense as a perfect, right? A lot of times you'll find in Koine Greek or in New Testament Greek that the writers will say something like exerkomai ek or aserkomai ace. Entering into. It's redundant, but that same sort of thing is being expressed here with exerkomai para. He came from, or he came out from the Father.
So, what tense is that word?
It's an aorist. Second aorist.
But you have this, that you hate the work, so Nicolaitans. Yeah, it's Revelation, remember about the letters to the churches.
Good.
So do you recognize names because there's a capital letter, or was that added?
Yeah. That is one of the key indicators in your text as well. If it has a capital, it's going to be a name or place or something along those lines.
Or interjection, like you make an O
Yeah, but Lord there, the reason that's being capitalized is because it's being used as a title. We know that it's being used as a title because...
Remember last week's Ogune Owamukrejupe?
Yes, that's right. They do capitalize that as well. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question for 14?
Yes.
The F2, you know, I have out of the world just as I am out of the world. And
Oh, for 14.
yeah, for 14. And
Alright, so let's do the translation as a whole, and then I'll, because we were just on 13.
Yeah.
Alright, so 14 is, I have given to them your word, or I've given your word to them. And the world does what?
Hated it.
Hates them,
Hates.
or hated. This is one of those narratival uses of the aorist. In our translation, we can be consistent, but we can throw it in the present, or we can throw it in the past. It's one of those, how do we render narrative sort of things.
Because when I looked it up, it said that the play word was hate, and I thought because it was in past, I needed to say hated.
Yeah, the world hated them.
Because, and then, so the ook is not, and asin is they are, after two. Now, they are out of the world.
Or they are not of or
So
from.
you can get rid of the, okay.
There's two cosmos, genitive.
X, a lot of times the basic meaning of the genitive and the meaning of X sort of coalesce. They share a similar semantic overlap. So it sounds like we're just doing away with the meaning of Ek, but we're really not. That's just the nuance that Ek has in that context.
Okay.
So they hate them because they are not from the world or of the world. And then the rest of that?
Just as I not am, or I myself, because it got the I and the Amy, I myself are not of the world.
Yep, I am not of the world, or from the world, or
And where did you get just as to?
kathos.
Paragraph 92.
You had to go back and look it up.
Yeah, just as.
I don't know if I've told you this before, and I'm seeing it play out right before my eyes as we're translating, that adverbs and prepositions are some of the more difficult pieces of vocabulary to learn. You will learn quickly, and typically in this order. Nouns are the easiest to learn because they're the most concrete. Verbs come after that. Then adjectives, but once we get into particles or particles, like a, which means or, they're like small pieces, small words, essentially, what a particle is.
Little building blocks.
Yeah, not building blocks, just little words. I don't know how to explain it better, but you have your adverbs and your prepositions. They're very difficult for us to memorize because they lack that definiteness. I don't mean that in a grammatical sense. They lack concreteness in the way that verbs and nouns have them. So dedicate attention to learning your adverbs, especially the ones that we've already gone over. Just as. All right, 15.
Alright, I was gonna get all the words in this. The not soldiers were the not soldiers, when they crucified Jesus, took the garment, or his garment, took his garment and made for, and I couldn't find what narrate was.
Okay. Let's try it again. This is un and not u.
Okay.
So u is no or not, and you translated un earlier. I know that you were the one that translated which exercise was number 10. I mean, you got it right.
Yeah, well, I was working on this 2 days later.
Okay. So it's not the not, it's then the soldiers. And everything else you had right, except for that last word, mere.
Which I couldn't.
That was like crucified. Stavosa.
Yeah, it's crucified.
Mm-hmm. We're looking for the very last word there, and I'm curious. Okay, so it's from meros on paragraph 115. I do have to say that is the one thing I don't like about these being divided up in the way that they are. It makes it difficult to find vocabulary. Like when it divides them up into separate sections, you're trying to look at it based on alphabetical arrangement. You got to go through each one of them. But yes, it means part.
Have you ever worked through Decker? Anybody sign that?
Which work of his
It's a workbook of
is Greek Reader?
yeah,
Greek Reader. I started to work through it, and I was considering maybe even using it for this.
Oh, okay.
Have you liked it or not?
It's fine. Yeah, we're using it in my class, and he has 4 different vocab lists for each. It's frustrating.
Yes, he does, and he does that for a reason, but I can see it being very frustrating.
Yeah.
Okay, so all at once, this is then the soldiers, and then think about setting it off with a comma. Then the soldiers, comma, when they crucified Jesus, comma, took his garments and made 4 parts.
That's a four.
It's fun. It's odd finding poieto there as opposed to something like marixo, which would be to divide.
What was weird? At point now.
Just word choice there. They made 4 parts as opposed to they divided. I would have probably done something like emerixon or emerixon is tesseron mera. Something along those lines. They divided it into 4 parts. But probably a good thing I didn't do it because it would be out of the case and spelled wrong and everything else.
And Abraham is Abraham.
Yes, Abraham is Abraham. Good.
So,
So 15.
our Abraham, the father of us, not from works was he justified.
Good. Abraham, our father, was not justified from works, was he? Right. That was a.
Theologically speaking.
No. What I was illustrating there with that was this little thing that we may have forgotten in that verse. It's a question, right? Paul is asking a rhetorical question.
Well, James.
James, sorry.
But you know, it's interesting. 'Cause I thought that James and Paul. Yeah, no. See, was not Abraham our father justified by works? Because
Okay, yeah,
that's
so
the odd thing. Because this in Romans, Paul and James use the same verse, come
Yeah.
to 2 different conclusions.
Yes. Was not. Yes.
Was not.
Our father Abraham justified by works.
Yeah, you come to exact wrong, I'm the opposite.
I want to be a little careful there.
Yeah.
And we'll move on. And
But I mean, you come to the exact opposite.
Mr. Luther over here is
What,
tempted
James?
to pull it out and
Yeah.
burn the epistle of straw.
Well, no, but James is saying, your faith is manifested in works, obviously. We all know that. But what I'm saying is you come to the exact opposite of what James had written. Nothing personal.
Yeah, that's right.
but so to translate this is Abraham our father, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not Ook. So where do you get the was not? Is it the
It's a question.
Said?
No, it's the
Or
the
semicolon?
right here, the semicolon, which tells us
Okay.
it's a question.
So we know that we need to construct it like a question to say,
Right.
was not Abraham our father justified
Right.
by works?
Doesn't, when they ask a negative like that, doesn't that imply a negative answer?
Rhetorically speaking. Yeah.
No, there's a specific construction that in the way the questions are phrased in Greek, expect a certain answer. And we will learn that in chapter 27, 26, something along those lines. I forget exactly where, but we'll save that for later. Mainly because I need to be refreshed on those rules myself, to be honest. I think it might be in chapter 22, maybe, or maybe later. I'll have to get back to you on that. But yes, you're right. It depends on the way that a word is. I mean, a sentence is constructed based upon tense and form of negation that expects a certain answer, whether it be yes or no. Okay, 17.
And those who he called, these also be justified. For whose?
You just translated it.
Those.
Oh, those.
Okay.
Those who justified, those he glorified, or those who glorified.
Okay, so, and those whom he called, these
He justified.
he also justified.
Or he could also.
The use of kai there.
Okay.
I thought it was and.
Yeah, it can be, we had these special uses or adverbial uses of kai, where it can mean even or also, depending upon the way that it's used. We know that it's not being used as and because there's nothing being linked here. If it were to be used as and, it would need to be in front of the tutus. And these he justified. But instead, these also he justified.
Is that a punctuation? I mean, in Thai and both saying? Or is that just a printer's word?
The little,
Dot.
yeah, it's like a comma or a semicolon.
Okay.
So in those whom he called, these also he justified. And those he justified, these also he glorified.
Go chain.
18.
But the Father judges no one. Is it another form of name?
Yeah, you got it. No one.
The Father judges no one, but he judges all.
Okay.
judges.
That he has given all judgment to the Son. Thank you.
Cheater. Memorizing Bible verses,
Yeah.
filling in the blanks.
Wow.
I'm glad somebody's calling him out instead of me.
You know what? If I could, I would. Kudos to your memorization.
You know, Timothy and I were doing Greek, and we were going through 1 John, and I was doing pretty good at translating. And after Timothy, good, where did I go? Timothy, he's read this. He's lucky. They realized you were to put these words in a bag and pull it out.
All right, we'll leave off there because we only have 30 minutes left for the class, and I do want to actually get to something else. And you guys do have Bibles, so if you need extra explanation, then. So I'm praying that you guys will bear with me because this is new for me. I'm breaking new ground, so to speak. Not that the subject is new to me, but I haven't taught this material ever. So,
Are we going to hang out?
no, the handout is going to be something that is going to be our homework. It's going to be taking what we talked about 2 weeks ago and talk about now, and seeing those principles being put into play in the examples that it gives you. All right, so the first week we broached the topic of textual criticism. If you recall, we talked about the different types of manuscripts that exist. We talked about what textual criticism is. We talked about how to read your apparatus and what those little marks signify in that apparatus. The grading that the committee has given them, and how to know whether you're looking at papyri, uncial, minuscule, a lectionary, a version, or a church father. So remember, our papyri are marked with a P. They come from the 2nd to the 8th century. They're our earliest manuscripts. The uncials are characterized by being written on vellum or animal skin. They come from the 3rd to the 10th century, and they're marked in your apparatus by an olive, by a Greek capital letter, or by a 0 in front of the number. Your minuscules are marked just by a number, no 0 in front of it. Those come from the 9th century and forward, and what characterizes those are that they are cursive script. And you have your lectionaries, and what those were books that were read in church services.
Cursive script.
They are cursive script.
I meant, you said minuscules are designated by.
They are designated by number with no 0 in front of it.
Okay.
So like 33 would be an important manuscript, for instance. Your versions just mean that it's Latin, Coptic, Syriac. It's just a different translation, an early translation. And then you have your church fathers, which are of importance, but are the least important because sometimes they're quoting from memory, or writing from memory, or are not quite as reliable. Today, we will broach the topic of the type of errors you will find in manuscripts. So one of those errors would be faulty word division.
I believe that.
Now, this one's tricky, right? Because in our uncial scripts, our early manuscripts, we're not going to have word divisions at all. So it shouldn't be an issue. But in our later manuscripts, the minuscules, as time goes on, they start to divide the words out. So they're starting to do some of the work for us. And sometimes they get it right, and sometimes they get it wrong. Here is an English example of what it would look like in your text. be God is nowhere or God is now here. Drastically different. Here would be Greek examples. Now, is that hati or is it hati? Another example would be
Sorry, that marker.
yeah, I'm about to switch. So this could be confessing, or confessedly great, rather. Remember our os can be an adverbial ending. Confessedly great. Or it could be a verb with hos. We confess how great, and then there's the verb estin, how great he is. So these are errors that can creep in. You have to make those sorts of decisions. Where is the word to be divided? Another,
How do you know that's confess or worship?
what do you mean?
Homologue understood that homologeos was also worship.
See, yeah, that is a rendering of that? I've always,
It's something I've read somewhere a long time ago.
I mean, it can be a form of worship.
And I heard a nice discussion on how it's the same thing. It means the same word. So you confess who God is. Maybe it's, we got to read Faust.
I think what you have there is importing a number of different concepts.
Yeah.
I'd be wary on that.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's not the case, but
Well, that's what I asked.
in this particular concept, it had context. It's confessing.
Okay.
All right. So we have that as an example of faulty word addition. Then we have instances where words are left out, and I'm going to give you two rather large words for this. I'm kind of curious if anyone can, who doesn't actually know the words, guess what they mean from knowing your Greek.
Going too many O's there.
Nope. Now both of these different errors can be described as haplography. You're skipping over words, but these are two of the more technical terms for what happens and why it happens. So homeoteluton and homeoarcton. I do have one too many there. Homeoarcton. Anyone want to take a guess on those?
Make sure it's not homeo, H-O-M-E-O.
H-O-M-O-E-O. H-O-M-O-E-O.
Really? Okay.
T-E-L-E-U-T-O-N.
The first one's something involving the purpose of man.
No, because you're reading in
Homo
That's
sapien.
Latin.
Homo sapien. You're reading in Latin, but Homo in Greek is same.
Intella is complete.
Yeah, or
Perfect.
end.
Yeah.
Yeah, so same.
Ending.
Same ending. Good. Same ending. So a word that ends the same
Same beginning.
and then same beginning. Good. Arco is to begin or to rule, or arche is in the beginning. N-arche. Same beginning. So we have words that begin the same or words that end the same with another piece in the text that looks the same. So our I skips from, say for instance, from here, a ton ending, like auton, to another word that ends with ton, and everything that intervenes has been lost. Or we have a word that begins with le, and another word that begins with le over here, and everything in between has been omitted.
That sounds serious. How do you know it's happened?
How do you know that it's happened? Well, in the text you'll see that an entire segment has been missing, and if it picks up in a very similar place in other manuscripts, then we have a good idea that something has dropped out.
And you hope that God reveals the original in a jar in a cave so you can put it back where it belongs.
No, we were dealing with thousands of manuscripts here, so we're able to compare the manuscripts to one another, and hopefully somewhere in those manuscripts is the correct reading. We also have what is called typography, and I'm hoping that we should be able to figure out what that means.
They're repeating the letters
Right, so it's been written twice.
twice.
We do this in our own writing if we're copying something. You're copying and you're copying and you don't realize that you've written what you've already written, and your eye goes back and you rewrite it.
Huh.
So that'll happen. And then there's some other ones like metathesis, for instance, and these happen a little bit less, so you don't have to focus as much on them. But I know that I've been doing this quite often in the projects that I'm doing in Latin. I'm writing down all of the Latin in the text, typing it up, and on the keyboard, at least, one of the keys that I hit will hit before the other one, so the letters have switched. Now that happens more often because of similar sounding things, like a labon becomes a balon, for instance, so instead of they took or they received, they cast out. So those letters have switched. That's what metathesis means, place after.
Yeah, it's scary. I don't know if it's getting old. Sometimes I'll type and I'll use a homonym in place, and I'll say, I should be home any time now, K-N-O-W. I had to go out of my way to type the K.
Yeah. So that'll happen. So you can see how all of these things can happen within the text. These are all what we call unintentional errors on the part of the scribe.
How about intentional ones?
Yep, and we have those as well.
They try to help.
Mm-hmm. So some of our intentional errors. We have grammatical improvements. So the scribe might come along a difficult phrase, and he recognizes it as such, and he changes a little thing here to make it flow better. You'll have liturgical changes, and these happen in the lectionaries as well. This is what I was talking about, in order to make it more suitable for the worship setting, or to spice up the language, or to make it more high or low, or whatever.
Do the name changes fall, like when they say instead of Jesus, but Christ Jesus, or Christ Jesus the Lord, or
Yeah, I mean,
amplify the names, but
that-
classify as person.
That could happen. I'm not. So the example that's given here is Matthew 6:13 at the end of the Lord's Prayer. That would be an example of liturgical addition.
Thy kingdom come. Thine is the kingdom, power, and glory forever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Then we have the elimination, I have to move quickly, of discrepancies.
Oh, I thought it was for that.
So he gives in Mark 1:2, you have in the prophets, and that is a variant for in Isaiah the prophet. So a scribe saw the difficulty there, so he's changed it to the prophets in general, because he didn't find the passage in Isaiah. That would be an example. Then you have harmonization. You got 4 Gospels. They're very similar, or at least 3 of them are similar in nature to one another. And a scribe might be familiar with Matthew, for instance, and say, well, Mark has a little bit of a difference here, so let's bring it in line. And then you have very, very few instances of doctrinal changes. Some people will like to make a lot of these, but most of the doctrinal changes are easily and readily found. So take, for instance, 1 John 5:7-8, where we have the Trinity testifying, right? Exactly. That's in the King James Version. And the note that Black gives here is that this passage has no non-suspect Greek manuscript support. As a matter of fact, the only time that manuscript comes in to support this reading is when Erasmus is challenged for not including it in his Greek New Testament. And then the person that challenged it all of a sudden found a manuscript that had it. In other words, he added it. So,
How about
the only one
Mark?
available.
The 16th chapter of Mark.
I think he argues that it's original.
I've read that too.
Yeah.
I
He
mean,
is among the minority.
There's nothing non-scriptural in it.
Right.
But
The argument for its exclusion is that or its inclusion is that it leaves the book unconcluded. So it provides a nice little wrap-up, which means that it should be, that argument cuts both ways. It was added because it ends abruptly, or it should be included because there is no ending.
and the argument against it is it doesn't turn up until sometime in the 16th century, I think.
I'm not as familiar on that argument as I probably should be. So I don't
I
want
think
to.
it's a footnote in the NIV.
It's a footnote in most of the modern ones.
Yeah.
That and the adultery passage.
Right.
If you're really interested in that one, I think Southeastern should be in the coming year having a conference on that passage with all sorts of different people who take different stances on it. But to not get waylaid too much, we just covered the different errors that can take place. There are intentional errors, there are unintentional errors to be aware of. Then we also have the topic of deciding. Between variants. Not by the way. How do we decide which reading is correct? There is external evidence and internal evidence. What would constitute external evidence?
Well, I said the church fathers, if they refer to particular reading, be good external evidence. We don't weight them as scriptural, but the fact that they, mention it does show, does place it at a certain time period, so we can have a marker for the dating
Yes,
area.
that's good. That's going a little bit more in depth in some of the principles that I'm going to give you, but that's very good because it tells us whether a reading existed earlier or later. It gives us a definite point for one reading over another reading. Yeah, absolutely. This is, here are some of the ones that I'm going to give you. First one is, and it ties right in with your suggestion, is the oldest manuscripts.
Oh, okay.
So our oldest manuscripts. Now some people will just leave it at the oldest manuscript because they want to have precedence, or not precedence, but a preference for the Alexandrian uncials, for instance. But,
So is age determined by the alphabet?
what now?
Is age determined by the alphabet choice? I mean the letter choice, not the Greek alphabet, but the Alexandrian versus the Byzantine.
It depends on who you're talking to. We have 3 different approaches to textual criticism so far as which families are to be valued most. There are the majority of reasoned eclectics who favor the Alexandrian text type. Then you have the Byzantine guys who favor, obviously, the Byzantine. And then Black takes a variant of reasoned eclecticism, which says that he values the geographical distribution the most of all, which we'll get there.
Okay.
Okay, so the oldest manuscripts. What manuscripts do we have that have the oldest readings? And that's where I wanted to modify this. Not the oldest manuscripts that we're looking for necessarily, but we're looking for the oldest reading. We can have a 10th century manuscript that possesses an older reading than a 3rd century manuscript. Now that gets a little bit dicey, so how do you determine that? Some instances that you can determine it is if your oldest manuscript possesses an obviously corrupted reading, like where it doesn't make any sense at all, or where one of those errors has taken place, like haplography or dictography or something like that. Then we have other manuscripts that might possess an older reading. So we need to be careful on
So it's not the material of written on, it's the actual reading.
And it gets a little dicey on how to trace those.
Yeah, the provenance.
So we have that, and then we have geographical distribution. What is the logic behind that one?
Well, I guess a clay jar and the Qumran caves would probably have better provenance for age or accuracy than, say, bound book in the Cambridge Library.
Well, let's give a little bit of humor here. If we find the New Testament in Qumran caves, that will be quite a miraculous find. Those are our Old Testament
Well, this
caves.
applies to Old Testament.
But this principle here is that if we have manuscripts in Egypt, if we have manuscripts in the Byzantine Empire, and if we have manuscripts in Rome that all share the same reading, then it is highly unlikely that some outlier will be the correct reading. Because what that tells us is that from a very early time, manuscripts were copied and sent to those various areas, and that it is stemming from an early reading. When we have agreement among geographical distribution, then that helps us. Travel didn't take place as much, so it's unlikely that there's too much mixing. It'll happen, but if we have an Alexandrian, a Byzantine, and a Western all in agreement, but then we have maybe one Alexandrian text that reads otherwise, then we've got a pretty good idea that that geographical distribution helps us. And this is, I hesitate even here. What What I'm saying here is you have those different text types, those different text families. Most of the time, they will agree with the distribution, the geographical distribution, but we won't always find these manuscripts in the places that they should. They might be of a different family and in a different place. So what he's saying here is that if we have an agreement with geographical distribution and text type agreement as well, then we're on really good grounds here. So a consensus of witnesses, manuscripts, versions, and fathers is necessary before we can say that the text type supports a particular reading. The important principle to remember is the greater number of text types in support of a reading, the greater probability of its originality. Because once again, that means that from an early time, the distribution of these manuscripts within the different families were in agreement at that point, and corruptions may have taken place later, but for the most part, they're in agreement. Now, on the basis of internal evidence, we have three basic principles, and we'll modify it with two more on top of that. The shortest reading is preferred. The example he gives is, well, he doesn't give any for these. So I don't at the moment. But you will see a lot of those examples in the reading that you've got.
So if something just says, God was pleased with his son, the Messiah, the Christ, the promised one, and you get a reading that just says God was pleased with his son, you go with that one.
Yes. And why?
Sure.
There's a reason behind that, right? If we take Debbie's example, which is a great one, we're multiplying titles for God's Son, right? It is likely that a scribe out of devotion to God or devotion to Christ has added these titles than it is that those titles have been omitted. Because if we have all of those titles, the scribe would be likely to keep them, right? Why would we omit something from the text that adds to the doctrine, for instance? You might be more inclined to add it. You might be more inclined to add a clause to explain the difficulty in a passage. Now, we need to be careful with this as well. These are general principles. Say, for instance, I have this sentence in the Greek, which you wouldn't. I went to the store and I bought bread and I drove home, right? Obviously not going to be there. A scribe might be likely to say, I went to the store and bought bread and drove home, omitting the I from each one of those other clauses, because it's redundant. We already know what the subject is. So, while the shortest reading is to be preferred, we need to understand that as well. Also, we need to factor in some of our errors, right? What error might this come into conflict with? Homoteleuton or arcton, right? Because those would, by their very nature, be the shorter reading. They've omitted an entire clause. So this isn't to be gone with if there are other explanations for it. We are to prefer, I'm getting that, prefer the more difficult reading. Why?
It's been edited, it's more likely to be edited in the direction of making it easier.
Right. A scribe is more likely to, if he comes across a difficulty in the text, make it easier to understand than he is to make it more difficult. Now, again, this is a generalization. If we have a text that is obviously incomprehensible, like for instance, a word doesn't even exist as a word because some other sort of error has taken place, or it just flat out doesn't make sense, then it's likely that a corruption of some sort has come into the text. But what we're talking about here is two readings are possible, and one is more difficult to understand because of grammar, because of theology, one of those factors, and it is more likely that the scribe has edited toward the easier reading. And this sort of helps with what I'm getting at. We're to go with the reading that best explains where the other readings came from. So if we have one reading that says, those are three different variations. Jesus came, the Messiah came, Jesus, the Messiah came. We have to work through that textual problem. Did a scribe come along and break this apart and say just Jesus came? Or the Messiah came? Or did this scribe here decide that he didn't want to omit anything at all, and he took a combination of the two and brought it in and expanded? Jesus, the Messiah came. Those are the sorts of things that you would have to work out.
So which one would you go with?
It's difficult.
Well, you said go with reading that best explains where the reading came from.
Right.
Shortest.
And we also factor in the quality of manuscripts so far as external evidence is concerned. We know in the Western tradition, for instance, scribes had the tendency to be more expansive. So if we find this reading in a Western text, we know that those scribes had the tendency to conflate readings. We just know that from the study of manuscripts. So we would, if we're looking at this in a Western, we might come to the conclusion that he has brought the two together. And then we have to choose between Jesus or the Messiah. And then we can make that decision based upon other external evidence or other internal evidence. Another thing to add to your internal evidence is the style of the author. So hypothetically, if your author never uses the title Messiah ever anywhere else in any of his writings, then it might be highly unlikely that he has used Messiah in this instance. The thing to remember about internal evidence is that it is always a game of probabilities. Reasoned probabilities. But to say that an author will never use vocabulary that is uncharacteristic of him limits him in a way that should not be limited. Right? We don't always use the breadth of our vocabulary in each document that we write. So we have to balance these things. And I know that that's not a comfortable thing to do. What I'm giving you here are principles for a task that you should be aware is a task far beyond me, which means it's beyond all of it. Not that sounds arrogant. What I'm saying is, it is a task for scholars who have done this for their entire lives.
So really, it gives the impression of the confidence you can have in your scriptures being.
Well, and that's where I'm going to work back. You might feel overwhelmed by this. We have these principles, and you can do text criticism. You can. You're not going to know the detailed information about each one of the manuscripts.
Yeah.
You're not going to know the habits of the scribe that wrote Sinaiticus, for instance, unless, that just becomes your itch. But a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that in textual criticism, there are a vast number of scribal errors that have taken place. Vast. Most of those scribal errors are like the addition or exclusion of an article. Or they are a difference in spelling, because spelling wasn't solidified at the time. Different ways of spelling different words with vowels. There are small details like this. Most of the errors are accounted for by that. There's another swath of errors that take place that have absolutely no translational effect. And there are a smaller number that do have a translational effect but don't impinge upon any doctrine. And then there are other errors that take place, like the addition or exclusion of the woman caught in adultery, or the ending of Mark, for instance. That whether or not they are included don't affect theology, but they tell us something about the early church's value of this story, or our value of the story, or anything along those lines. They teach us about the theology of communities by the way that a particular manuscript is tweaked or altered. So when you approach this task, know that while it is the Word of God, and it is our responsibility for determining to the best of our ability what it is, based upon what scholars have delivered to us as internal and external evidence, is the best ways to solve those problems, that you are not going to do harm. You're not being let loose to determine what God's Word is. We have a reliable text